And hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on Reframing by Pearson. It's being hosted by the Misophonia Institute, and we are very happy to have you here today. Pearson has practiced neurolinguistics programming for over a decade now, and is a therapist in the north of England. He's best known to me for having developed the sequent repatterning therapy treatment for misophonia, which is one of the few treatments for misophonia that was specifically designed for misophonia. So, Chris, we're happy to have you here presenting today and sharing with us about reframing. So I'll turn it over to you and I'll mute my video.
Thank you very much, Tom. And I'm reluctant to say good afternoon. I know that for many of you it is afternoon, but some it's morning, so I'll say good day to you. Welcome to this reframing webinar. As Tom said, I'm Chris Pearson. I'm a therapist working in Yorkshire in the UK, but also internationally online. As Tom mentioned, this presentation has been made possible by the Misophonia Institute. And today we're going to look at what is reframing in detail a little later, but for now, I'd just like to think in terms of a definition. And this one was provided by Annette Crane, who's quite well known in psychological and neuropsychological circles. And she says that reframing is the ability to change your perspective deliberately. And I think that's a careful choice of words there. It's a powerful brain-based process that enables you to approach people, situations, and behavioural change with curiosity, flexibility, and a constructiveness. Effective change often starts from within, from changing our perceptions. So for now, let's just start with how we might use the reframing process. Now, reframing is an important part of sequent repatterning. The frame is our frame of reference. It's not a fleeting frame of mind, but it is the way that we create a structure of beliefs and concepts. And those beliefs and concepts in turn direct our behaviour. And so this process of repatterning fits into the programme of sequent repatterning, a little way down the process. It's placed here to provide a confident step into the future. The previous steps that we've been through all provide resources that make the frame change more effective when it comes. And the frame change that we endeavour to elicit allows that individual to benefit from the previous resource building activities that we've done. So usually we'd see reframing occurring in the sequent repatterning process around about the 5th session out of perhaps 8. In sequent repatterning, we have most usually used the NLP Six-Step Reframe protocol. The Six-Step Reframe protocol is part of New Code NLP, and it does in some ways very much resemble the perspective reframe that I'll talk about a little bit later. So I mentioned before what perhaps we mean by reframing, and if I can just get the slide change. We begin to see that a frame of reference is about the meaning that we apply to anything that happens around us. So reframing is in fact an entirely and wholly natural process. It's a process that we all use to make sense of the world around us Now, when I refer to the world, I mean our world, and that's the space and the time that surrounds us, and all those activities, everything that seems to be entirely beyond our control, but also our inner world. And from this perspective, again, we must consider the inner world to be not simply important, but certainly something which should be respected. And in exactly the same way as when we do parts work, the inner world is our arena. It's within the inner world that we make these changes. Now, every one of us perceives every frame of reference that we have as being good, as being right, deserved, and correct. And it's true that we all need to feel deep down that we really deserve what happens to us in life and what we get in life too. So in the reframing process, we're really not even thinking about what is right or wrong, because every one of us and every client that we might work with will believe that their frame of reference is right. Now, these beliefs that we have are a part of the brain. And so changing the frame of reference that we have, the belief, means changing the brain. So from that perspective, it is a neurological process. And because it's a neurological process, we need to think about where it happens, how it happens. So let's just take a minor diversion into neurology of this. Now, quite obviously, we're looking at emotions today, people's feelings, our clients' feelings. And we're also looking at reframing the emotional process. So if we're thinking about the emotional process, our first stop, if you like, is to look to the limbic system, the unconscious or the subconscious, as some may call it. And in this instance, I think specifically to the amygdala. And the amygdala is a small walnut-sized structure in the brain. There are two. It's a bilateral structure. And it's a part of the brain that is always on the lookout for threats and for potential threats. Now, perhaps 30,000 years ago, wandering on the plains of Africa as hunter-gatherers, those whose amygdala responded instantly, effectively, to a rustle in the leaves may have protected their person from some kind of predatory attack. But quite obviously, over millennia, the DNA of those with an active and effective amygdala has been retained to the point where now, when perhaps we need that protection rather less, it is very much a core feature of our behaviour. The amygdala, as you can see from the picture here, is right down towards the brain stem, and you'll also see that it is relatively small. There are very many connections into the amygdala, but in fact there are more coming from the amygdala into what we think of as being the thinking brain. And this very much does have a consequence. There's a concept which is known by many as the amygdala hijack. It's an occasion when the thinking brain, the logical thinking brain, is literally flooded with waves of rapidly created signals. And those signals, those stimuli, overwhelm the thinking brain and really reduce logical thought. Now, at this stage, it's probably useful to consider that the sensory input that comes into our bodies, into our brain, is routed through the reptilian complex, that part of the brain stem, and through the amygdala. It takes the amygdala around about 80 milliseconds to process most sensory information, and yet we're aware of it in the logical thinking brain around about 250 milliseconds later. So there's a huge amount of processing that's going on in that time lapse. Now, quite obviously, that rapidity of processing is very useful in a genuinely dangerous situation. If we're confronted by a striking snake, it's far better to respond automatically and very quickly to save ourselves. If we compare that to the perhaps activity of eating a meal with a loved one and having an inappropriate and uncomfortable response to that, then perhaps it seems to make rather less sense. But the amygdala is activated in social situations in very many instances. It reacts very strongly to issues of status and very, very strongly to threats of loss of status. And it also responds very generally to micro messages, those small non-verbal signals that are sent out by humans and received by those around them and interpreted sometimes wrongly, but mostly very intuitively and appropriately. It's also important here to realize and to accept that the amygdala works in low resolution, just like the slide here. The view that the amygdala has of the world outside our bodies is rather pixelated. It's very true that it does receive input which is in high definition. It receives input, for instance, from the eyes, which is a measure of the photons that are reaching the retina, in the order of millions of bits of information every second. And yet its processing is all done at a much lower resolution, and its output to the thinking brain is probably in the region of around about 100 bits a second. So there are tens of thousands of times reduction in the definition of what is processed and what is input. Now that means that the amygdala can very often recognize as sane events that really are only similar. And this perhaps has some consequences in learning, and learning which may well be inappropriate. There is a further very common activator of the amygdala which has a big consequence for people. And this is the instance where goals are too large. Goals that are too big will overwhelm many individuals, and that's because they activate the amygdala. And in those instances, very often reducing the size of a goal makes it acceptable. And quite obviously, by dividing a task up into smaller steps, into small sub-goals, if you like, then each of those tasks becomes acceptable and doesn't turn on the amygdala. because as we'll see a little later, the amygdala can almost halt logical conscious thought. So, when the amygdala is activated, we feel emotional, we have feelings. And there are three courses of action that we might well have. For instance, if we take anger, so let's just imagine there's a person, Joe. Joe is angry. And there are three courses of action that she might have. She might express that anger, she might suppress the anger, or she might reframe it. Now, for many years, the principle of acting out, of working through emotions, of venting anger was promoted. But in fact, it can be shown, and it's been shown through studies, it's been shown through functional MRIs, that venting anger and focusing on it, in fact, increases its power. It begins to connect the experience with the emotions. And as we all remember that rather fetching rhyme of the neuroscientists, neurons that fire together, wire together. And so we very soon end up with an emotion that can be switched on by that anger, by that event very quickly. Now, suppression fails to diminish emotion too, because it doesn't suppress brain activity. And in fact, trying to suppress an emotion while the event is in process simply increases amygdala activity. And again, that's something which is shown on functional MRIs. And the individual begins to feel very uncomfortable trying to suppress that. The third option is to reframe the emotion. And you will find very often that the process of reframing is referred to by scientists as cognitive reappraisal, and either term I think is probably acceptable, although quite obviously reframing is a much easier thing to remember than cognitive reappraisal. Now, if you're interested in finding out rather more about reframing and those aspects of it that I've touched upon so far, moved on rather more quickly than I meant to there. I do apologise. There are some papers which have been collected and presented by Stanford University. Sorry, I will return to that in just a few moments. When we come to think about reframing, though, it's important to consider these three whats. You must consider that these allow us to reappraise, and that reappraisal involves the left prefrontal cortex. And we know that left prefrontal cortex activity calms the amygdala. But reappraisal generally is initiated in the front of the brain, in the logical thinking brain, while emotional processes usually move forward from the back of the brain. And it can again be shown that reappraisal can moderate the emotional process. So simply thinking about what we pay attention to allows us to reduce the emotional effect of it. And this also takes into account the process of effective priming. And this is a way for us to prepare ourselves for something that is going to happen. It allows us to be ready for that thing to happen. And that's really just a question of sitting and considering how things might be and thinking how we'd like them to be. And I'll return to that in a little while when we just look at the process of self-directed neuroplasticity, which sounds really exciting. So, when we read about reframing, especially in NLP context, we see that there are obvious differences between what happens and its context. And so we have this idea of there being a context reframe, which really means giving a new meaning to the same content, and to a content reframe, which usually requires more content, more detail, so that we can provide a new focus or show that it has a different meaning to the one that we originally considered. But as I mentioned just now, what we're calling reframing is more formally known as cognitive reappraisal, and the slide that I was surprised I didn't find just now is this one. Now, if you follow this link to spl.stanford.edu/papers.html, you'll find that the Stanford University have very kindly made available a vast number of documents. If you type into the search box there, cognitive reappraisal, you'll find many documents, not just about the neurology of cognitive reappraisal, but also about techniques to bring that about. So follow that link for more information. I'll just leave that on the screen for perhaps long enough if you want to just make a note of it. And then we come to really the key or the focus of this webinar today, which is looking at how we can bring about reframing, the ways that we can reframe. Now, the first protocol that I'm going to mention here is very often referred to as the Robinson Crusoe reframe. And this is a reframe that asks a person to look at both sides of an experience. If you like, to create a table with one side the minus points, the downsides, and on the other side the pluses, the benefits. The classic example in the Robinson Crusoe reframe is that Robinson Crusoe writes on his minus side, "I am marooned on a desert island with no chance of rescue," which does seem to be a fairly negative kind of experience. On the plus side, he writes, "But I am alive and I didn't drown like everybody else." And there are probably other aspects of his experience that would find entries on this same table. He hasn't got any clothes to wear, but here on a tropical island, you don't need clothes to wear. It's warm, it's always very pleasant. Now, as we begin to think of these plus sides, we just come to this idea of self-directed neuroplasticity. Now, we all know that the brain remains plastic for life. It's something that we didn't perhaps some years ago, but we do now know that the brain remains neuroplastic from the day from before we're born to the moment that we leave this world. And self-directed neuroplasticity is a way that we can consciously control how we want our brains to work. So, looking at it from a slightly different perspective, if you want your brain to become better in a certain situation, say in social situations, then you force yourself to be more comfortable in these situations. You do it whether you liked it or not. You do it in your imagination, and your brain will eventually adapt. For many years, I think therapists have been telling clients that if they imagine something, that their brain will accept it in exactly the same way as if they experienced it. And that if we imagine something, it eventually becomes our reality. And that's because eventually our brain will adapt, and the neurology will treat that as though it was in fact an experienced moment. The theory really is that the mind is responsible for controlling the brain, and this was put forward quite some time ago by a scientist called Schwartz, and he makes an argument for this occurring. And for a long while, I think people have been sceptical of this idea, but it does seem to be demonstrable. So the way to ensure a change of brain is behind the concept of self-directed neuroplasticity. We begin by focusing our attention on that particular aspect of life. And quite obviously, if we look back to those 3 whats that we considered earlier on, our target here really should be to pay attention to the things that you want rather than the things that you don't want. We then need to look at our motivation, our determination, because just simply paying attention is good, but we really need to be passionate about the way that we feel. We need to make this real for the brain. Then we need to activate the brain. And the brain activation is very often a result of focusing the attention and guiding the willpower, the volition, the motivation. And then finally, the consistency. And this is something which we try to ensure sequence repatterning clients have a very focused awareness of. We need consistency. We need to continue. And it may well be that a program of therapy completes, but the individual must continue to practice and to keep these things real. So just moving on now to another protocol, the discovered benefits protocol, sometimes called the finding benefits protocol. And this is very much about discovering the gains from a negative experience. We want to change, oh, why did it happen, to what happens next. It's very much the basis on which the thoughts about post-traumatic benefits. There's often considered to be a trauma benefit, and that many of those who have undergone almost unimaginable trauma appear to almost bounce back and to do the kinds of things that you would perhaps not have expected them ever to do before they began. Then we move on to what is really a more reflective approach. And this is questioning one's own assumption. And here we need to look at what we expected. Look at what happened. And then look at what is possible. Now, the one that begins to come, if you like, to the NLP Six-Step Reframe is this one of perceptual positioning. Now, this is a very powerful technique, and it involves looking, first of all, at what happens and how we feel from the first position. And the first position is looking at it from within ourself, exactly how it feels, what emotions are involved, how it affects us. And then to consider position 2, the position of other, another, looking in. So what we want to do is to step into another person's shoes here, the other person involved even. To ask that question, I want to know what you know in the way you know it. Sometimes not as easy as it might sound, but once you're able to see that other person's perspective of what is happening to you, you begin to understand. The third position is that of a third party, of an observer. And to look at it from the third position, you leave the emotions behind. This is very often referred to as the meta position. You sometimes hear people say, we'll be meta. This is about looking as an outsider and as an impartial outsider. There are two further positions too. Position 4, which is that of the system or the organisation, the environment, if you like. And the 5th position is the universal position, or sometimes called the rocket position. It's about looking at the entire experience from high above. And when we look at it from high above, we see everything and very generally get a much better perspective on things. There's also a timeline reframe. And this way we look at the many options that we have and the many options from which we might pick. And sometimes it may seem that we can't really escape from the feeling that we must do either this or do that, and that the two are somehow mutually exclusive. And by placing things on a timeline, we can begin to see how we can achieve one thing and then another, and that these may be mutually beneficial, or they may in fact be quite separate, but that we don't have to choose one or the other. If you like, we don't have to be happy or sad. We don't have to be calm or angry. We can do these things separately at separate times. We shouldn't confuse this cognitive reappraisal protocol, though, with timeline therapy. This is just really about placing individual items or events in the context of passing time. Now, the 6-step reframe is, as I mentioned before, very much associated with the perceptual reframe technique. It's part of New Code NLP, And in some areas, it does also begin to stray into areas that you might consider to be parts work. The technique itself was developed by John Grinder. It's said to be useful with almost any behavioural issue, which is why I guess we chose it as the first candidate in sequent repatterning. It is indeed very effective. And it's very often a good technique where a client says that they want to change their behaviour, but they don't know why they continue with the old behaviour. And perhaps there might even be a secondary gain involved in retaining that existing behaviour. But there are quite obviously 6 individual steps to the Six-Step Reframe. And the first one is to identify the behaviour that we want to change. But we do that from that third position. We do it as though we're an observer. So very often if we are working with a client, we'll ask them to imagine that they are indeed somewhere in the room, but they're observing. And they're observing the therapist along with the person, the client. And then the therapist may well ask the client in the third position to identify the client in the first position. And names usually really get a very powerful and clear response because they're so core to our identity, and it begins to take the client into a especially dissociated state, but also into one where they can begin to observe what's happening rather than being involved in this process personally. Now, NLP usually asks us then to, in step 2, establish the unconscious communication through some kind of idiomotor signal. And that idiomotor signal is very often movement of the finger or a nod of the head. But obviously, if you're working online with a client, a nod of the head is much more useful. But I find that just asking a client to respond to speak is almost as straightforward and very often enhances clarity. But once we've established that communication with the client's subconscious mind, we then, as step 3, confirm what was the positive intention behind the difficult or the behaviour that we want to remove or change. Now, of course, we accept here that the acquisition of any behaviour is always done for the most positive of intentions, that no behaviour is ever established for anything but a positive outcome, and that what we see as being the bad effects or problems of a behaviour are very much side effects, unexpected side effects, but side effects nevertheless. So once we've at step 3 confirmed the intention, its aim, its purpose, if you like, then at step 4 we ask the unconscious mind to generate new behaviours. Now the classic NLP 6 steps suggests that the unconscious generates 5 new behaviours that will satisfy all of the positive intentions, but also allow change to occur, that allow those positive intentions to be put in place without the unwanted side effects. I think for many, just finding 1 or 2 can be just as useful. And I think it also depends on the source that you read as to how many you should endeavour to elicit. As we then come towards the conclusion of this protocol, At step 5, we get the subconscious mind to accept responsibility for the change work. Sometimes it's just a question of saying, that is now going to be the way things are. Sometimes there's a negotiation, very much as there is in parts work, which allows the behaviour to test out its new ways of working, just to perhaps trial it for a week, 2 weeks, 3 months. And then finally to do an ecology check. And that ecology check is very much about asking the person and observing from afar and from within in the first position whether or not those changes that have been suggested are acceptable in the longer term, in the greater scheme of things. Now, I do appreciate that the six-step reframe I have gone through in rather more detail than the others. I think that the fact that we're now nearly 40 minutes into the presentation shows us that perhaps we are recognising that there's a lot to cover in this, especially if we go into detail. I think just before we move out of this, it's important also to mention a concept of pruning of sensory input. A lot of workers will use the term or the sentence, you see what you know. And it is very true that we all make reality fit our existing categories. We make reality fit what we believe. So we're always biased towards what really confirms our existing beliefs, and reframing quite obviously challenges those existing beliefs. So sometimes it's perhaps necessary to bring something into the picture which is surprising, something which leads towards upsetting those self-fulfilling prophecies of seeing what we already know. Perhaps even to ask ourselves or to ask our clients, what would happen if you really started to pay attention differently? So we come to a summary, I think, at this point. We know that reframing, I do apologise, reframing is a natural process. It's something that happens to us usually in moments of crisis. It's something which stark contrast of experiences or juxtaposition will bring about. It's about reconsolidating behavioural memories in very many ways. It is quite clearly a neurological process. It involves the mind, but it is a neurological process. The successful outcome of reframing is a brain that has changed. And it can be a self-managed process, or it can be achieved while working with a therapist. But either way, the concepts are very much the same. And so that really brings us to the conclusion of the presentation as it is. I will very much accept that there are many areas of this that we have simply touched upon. I hope that if you are interested, you might go to the Stanford site and to find out more. I hope that those of you that are interested, especially from the perspective of treating misophonia, will be prepared to get in touch and maybe not just to discover more, but also to let us know about your own experiences and how they may help others in the wider sphere. To get in touch, you can use the contact form on my website at www.chrispearson.co.uk, or you can go to the misophoniatreatment.com website. My personal email is chris@chrispearson.co.uk, which isn't on the slide there, but is fairly straightforward. And yes, David, I saw your comment, a quote from Homer Simpson, and I kind of remember that, and it did make me smile. In fact, it made me pause mid-flow when I read it. Make your goals tiny and you won't be whining. So we've a couple of comments that have come in. Right, well, that's it. Well, the name there says online alias. I'm not sure who that is, but yes, the plus and minus table, I think, does have a number of titles. Although I must confess that Robinson Crusoe rather appeals to me. Not quite sure why, but he rather does. Maybe it's because he always looks scruffy, but let's not go any further along those lines. Tim says they've tested the theory, yes, and just imagining calf muscles being exercised results in them increasing in strength. And I think they also did some experiments with muscles in the lower arm and tendons into the small finger of the hand. But quite obviously, we now have the luxury of being able to watch these things happen neurologically on functional MRI scans, whereas even 20 years ago, I think we had to just accept what we observed and to then make hypothetical statements about that. Christoph, I would always, I think, counsel using the NLP Six-Step Reframe if you have no previous experience. I don't know quite obviously what your background is, but the one thing about the NLP Six-Step protocol is that it is exceptionally well documented. You can read in the NLP background material how it was formulated, where it comes from, certainly the input of other therapists and psychotherapists of the mid-20th century in terms of putting it together. And it is also very structured. And I think that it is quite important to work with something which has a clearly defined structure if you're perhaps unsure of the less formal ways of delivering this therapy. As with parts work, I think as you get into reframing, you do genuinely begin to see all kinds of alternative and better ways of delivering it, and also of personalizing those particular approaches for individual clients. And that again is really worth, well, it pays dividends in dealing with individuals if you really know exactly what is best for them. It's very difficult for somebody who finds it difficult to dissociate from their feelings to take a third or fourth or fifth position and observe a process in the perceptual protocol. Right, well, I think we've got 11 minutes. I felt rather pleased with myself that I finished within a minute of my my planned time of 45 minutes. But are there any other questions that we have at the moment? I see Christoph and online alias are both typing. But no further. Yeah, okay, Christoph. I think it needs us to look at individual cases quite clearly. If we encounter someone who becomes very uncomfortable because others are sniffing, perhaps, then we can begin to look at reasons why people sniff. And when we begin to look at the reasons why people sniff, we can begin to think about reasons why we might be vigilant. Now, I feel very reluctant to go into great detail about these particular reframes, because I do find that with most clients, if they have, if you like, an inkling of where we're going, there are opportunities for them to be resistant. But very certainly, there are reasons that people sniff. There are reasons why we're vigilant about those sounds. People sniffing sound a little like snakes. People sniffing, for instance, also may have some kind of contagious disease, even if it's only a bad cold. There are many reasons that the amygdala will pick up that particular sound. Now we can, however remote this may sound in terms of our reality, our logical reality, we can begin to look at each of those and see why it might be important to us. It might be important to recognize those things, but also to recognize that the amygdala in its low resolution way may not be seeing these things appropriately, and that it may be recognizing one thing when in fact it's hearing another. And then from that point onwards, we can begin to challenge, and we can begin to ask for changes to be recognized. And it's in recognizing change that we begin to find the process of change occurring. And I've kind of, again, scooted along on the surface of that, Christoph. But as I say, I like to keep the reframes rather close to my chest, especially if we're dealing with an audience where perhaps one day we may be using them for real. Okay, Christoph, thank you.
So, Chris, I have a question. I know of when I was first looking into misophonia, I met an individual who had several triggers, for example, to chewing with one of them. And so he started thinking of the sound of walking on leaves in autumn, and that was a very nice sound for him.
Yep.
And because he heard that sound, he thought of walking on leaves as a pleasant thing. He stopped triggering to that sound. Is that a form of reframing?
No, that's very much a conditional reframe, which is not, I would say, within my area of expertise, but
Okay.
it is exactly the same process, I feel, that it is re-establishing changed neural networks and bringing about that neural change, but through the process, I feel there of the conditioning,
Okay.
rather than it being of cognitive perception.
Okay.
Yeah.
So another example from my life is my wife used to become very upset. Even you would say she was, but this is before we knew about misophonia. She was triggered by the sound of my electric toothbrush.
Yeah.
And one night she decided that people all over the world use electric toothbrushes, and that it was perfectly fine for me to use electric toothbrush, and the sound no longer bothered her. Instantly, from that point, that sound no longer created that great distress. Is that another example of reframing or not?
I think that is absolutely the point. And there, if perhaps to return to Christoph's question earlier, there we might genuinely suggest that although having discomfort with you using your electric toothbrush, which is 2 minutes every evening, say that she was there, maybe she doesn't hear you doing it in the mornings or whatever, but every evening she is exposed to you for those 4 30-second sessions that the toothbrush encourages you to do, and it makes her feel uncomfortable. But on the other hand, you've still got your teeth. She doesn't have to spend the other 1,438 minutes of the day with you with missing teeth. So there is actually a benefit to this. And I'd be looking to work along those lines, perhaps.
Okay. We have a question from Mercedes. Do you think reframing would work for everybody, all misophonics, regardless of the cause of their misophonia?
I think that reframing helps anyone who feels uncomfortable in almost any way. I think that for those who have misophonia, reframing can help any of them. I think that it does, to an extent, work only with those that are prepared to accept the aspect of volition. They have to want it to work. There are some techniques that we glibly say to clients work whether you believe in them or not. But I think that reframing is very much one of those areas of psychology or neuropsychology, if you like, that requires the buy-in of the client. If the client doesn't get what it is that we're doing, it doesn't work as well. Does that answer your question, Mercedes? Thank you. Right. I think this will probably need to be our last question, but what is the approach to do reframing with a client who has done reframing before with equivocal results, shall we say? I think what we need to do first of all is to look and see how well that client responded in the first place. If they got some benefits from it, then I think that we need to look at the perceptual aspects of what those benefits were, how they helped. We then need to look at ways that we might modify the approach. And very often the Robinson Crusoe style is something that appeals very much to somebody who is very analytical. And if it's somebody who's much more a kind of touchy-feely kind of person than a thinky, analytical person, then we might need to look at a different approach. But generally speaking, I think that there is sufficient variety for us to be able to, first of all, reframe the original results in a positive way, and then to look at a different approach for the subsequent attempts. Mercedes, if you look at Banda and Grinder's write-ups for the six-step reframing, they will tell you that the percentage is exceptionally high, in the 80s and 90s of percentages. I find that we very often need to modify the technique that we're using in order to get the kind of results that we're looking at. So it is highly effective, and in habits and certain other areas, and as an adjunct to other therapies with phobias, for instance, it can be exceptionally, almost faultlessly effective. Christophe has come back with, is it one of several tools in the sequent repatterning? If I can just go back to the presentation here, and just, that's the one I was looking for. You'll see, Christophe, that the sequence, because sequent repatterning is a sequence, it's a program. We move from, if you like, safe place resource identification into looking at old emotions, and also into resource anchoring through parts work, and then into reframing. Now, the parts work very much gives us a basis for the reframing, but it also gives a therapist very hard information, certain information about how that particular individual is going to respond in reframing. And I think that we would be choosing the precise protocol based on the work that we've done in parts. Occasionally you find that because of circumstances we need to swap these two around, that the reframing needs to come before the parts work, and I think on occasions that probably can have a potential to compromise the sequence. I'm not saying that it does, but we very much need to understand the individual before we get to the reframing.
Okay, Chris, we think it's time to say thank you to everyone and to sign off. Appreciate your presentation and your being here today.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'll just in 5 seconds answer Mercedes. Certainly, if we look at the 6-step reframe, there are very many step-by-step guidelines for that. For the others, you may need to search around a little bit. But Mercedes, if you'd like to get in touch with me direct, I can certainly either provide you with those or point you in the direction of a website to find them. I would prefer, Mercedes, if you could do it by email or by the contact form on my website. I get kind of really overwhelmed by Facebook. In fact, I think Facebook is an activator of my amygdala. Well, thank you all. Thank you for attending. And thank you very much, Tom, for hosting this. And I do appreciate the efforts of the Misophonia Institute. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Okay, we've stopped the recording, Chris. We still have a good list of attendees still. They're online to stay to the end. Thank you, everyone. And we actually have a good number of individuals who registered so that they could watch the replay. So
I think very often when we have an international audience, it's only natural that we should indeed provide the recording, because listening to it in the middle of the night is probably not what I'd choose to do.
It's only our Aussies that have that problem, I believe. So
I do appreciate your rising early anyway, Tom, to do this.
It's not too bad here. It's only normal. It's normal work time. So, and also I'm recording hopefully recorded the presentation correctly on another computer so that we can generate a file for YouTube, and we'll get that up to YouTube. So,
right. I'm on my way back down to London again tomorrow on the train. I did see that Karen was.
Yes,
here.
we do, Elizabeth. We do know that this is still being heard by everyone. So, Chris, do you know that everybody's listening to us?
I did, yeah. That's why I was asking if Karen was still online, but I think she may well have bailed out. But I wasn't sure whether she was going to the event in London as well, which is why I was mentioning it.
Oh. All right, everyone. We're going to shut it off now for real. Goodbye.